If y'all would turn with me to the book of Esther, if you haven't already. We're going to be in Esther chapters 9 and 10 this evening, which means that we will be finishing, Lord willing, the series tonight. And if you will recall what we saw last week, if you will remember, so Esther is with the king and with Haman at the feast that she had requested, right? The second feast that she had brought them to, and she reveals to the king, her husband, that she's actually a Jew and that Haman is responsible for trying to not only kill her, but kill all of her people. And we see that whenever that was revealed to the king, he decides to have Haman killed. And last chapter, what we saw was after that it all had been taken care of, it seems like the king was actually going to leave the edict in place and kind of just move on after he has kind of saved Esther and Mordecai and he gave them an elevated position. It seems like he was going to kind of just let the Jews kind of suffer. And so what we see in chapter 8 was that Esther once again goes to intercede for her people. So not only did she do it earlier, but now she does it once again and comes to the king and intercedes and makes the request that he would bring salvation to the people. And he reveals that he actually, because the Persian law is basically once the king has sent out an edict, it cannot be revoked. And so what the king does, rather than say, I'm going to take back the edict, he says, I'm going to give you the authority to write another edict. And so what they do is Mordecai gets with the scribes and they make another edict that basically states that the Jewish people are allowed to prepare and to defend themselves on this day where the Jewish people's enemies will come to try to attack, to destroy, to annihilate them. And so what we described and what we talked about a little bit last time was not only would this be helpful that it gives the Jewish people legal rights to prepare for battle, which would have been important, but it also kind of shifts the cultural perception of what the king's position is on this matter, right? So the fact that this second edict is coming out saying that the Jewish people can defend themselves, there would have put some implications out there that basically the king is in support of the Jewish people now. So that would have maybe shifted some of the popular opinion of the day, because there could have been a lot more people that may have tried to attack and pillage the Jewish people and their possessions if the king hadn't allowed this second edict to come out. And so we see that after Esther has interceded, we see that they then make and write the second edict, and now they send it out throughout the region, and it results in a lot of joy and celebration. And they actually says that the Jewish people have holidays as they're now thankful that they actually have a chance now, a fighting chance in this battle that's going to happen with their enemies. Well, what we're going to find now in chapters 9 and 10 is really the final fallout of this, where we're going to finally get to that day, which, if you will remember, the day that Haman, he kind of used the pour, right, which is like the ancient form of a dice. He rolled the pour, and it landed on a certain date, right? Well, in chapter 9, we're going to finally get to that day where he had decided this is when we're going to try to kill the Jewish people. And so chapter 9 is going to be the final day now, where the enemies are going to come after the Jewish people, and the Jewish people are going to defend themselves, and we'll kind of see basically how it all plays out in these final chapters. So if you haven't already, just turn with me to chapter 9, and we're going to read through all of chapter 9 and also chapter 10, which chapter 10 is really only 3 verses. So we'll finish this evening. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command that his decree to be executed. On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, and that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon all people. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. And in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Also, Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmishta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vajasatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, they killed. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. On that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan, the citadel, was brought to the king. And the king said to the queen, Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Or what is your future request? It shall be done. Then Esther said, if it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded this to be done. The decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. And the Jews who were in Shushan gathered together again on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men at Shushan. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. The remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered together and protected their lives and had rest from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of their enemies, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were at Shushan assembled together on the 13th day, as well as on the 14th, and on the 15th of the month they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who dwelt in the unwalled town celebrated the 14th day of the month of Adar with gladness and feasting as a holiday, and for sending presents to one another. And Mordecai, who wrote these things and sent letters to all the Jews near and far, who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to establish among them that they should celebrate yearly the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted the custom which they had begun, as Mordecai had written to them, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to annihilate them, and had cast Pur, that is, the lot, to consume them and to destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. So they called these days Purim, after the name Pur. Therefore, because of all the words of this letter, what they had seen concerning this matter, and what had happened to them, the Jews established and imposed it upon themselves and their descendants and all who would join them, and without fail they should celebrate these 2 days every year according to the written instructions and according to the prescribed time, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, that these days of Purim should not fail to be observed among the Jews, and that the memory of them should not perish among the descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai, the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews to 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their fasting and lamenting. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. And King Ahasuerus imposed tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. Now all the acts of his power and his might, and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, as well as received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people, and speaking peace to all his countrymen. So that is the end of the book of Esther. And so what we see in these final 2 chapters is that after they had made the second decree, it had been dispersed throughout the kingdom. We see they arrive on this 13th day of the 12th month of Adar. And what happens is it says that the enemies have been preparing and have been excited, and they're thinking they're going to finally destroy and annihilate the Jews. And then it says in verse 1, that's the opposite of what happened. It says that immediately the Jews completely wiped out their enemies. In self-defense, which some people, they see that and they see kind of what happens in the story, and they're like, well, that actually kind of seems a little ruthless of the Jews. It's important to remember this is self-defense. This is a wicked decree that was coming against them, and what they are literally doing is they're not going and pillaging people. It even says 3 different times in this section that they didn't grab the plunder. They didn't take any of the possessions, which Haman was trying to do. They literally are just defending themselves, and they're fighting back, and they're winning. So that's what we're seeing here. So it says that the opposite happened, and it says that they conquered their enemies, and after the first day, it says there was like 500 that had been killed, and then there's another grouping of 300, and the king's asking basically, what should we do? And Esther says we need one more day to do basically exactly what we just did. And then we see that in the outer regions that there's 75,000 people, men that are killed. So that means that, you have the 500, the 300, and 75,000. So think how many different people groups were waiting to try to kill the Jews. That's how many people we see there. So it says that they conquered all of them, including the 10 sons of Haman. And not only do they kill the sons of Haman, which by the way is really interesting. If Haman is, it says he's an Agagite, which many think that he is a descendant from the Amalekites. We actually see maybe God wiping out the enemies that King Saul refused to. If you remember, he was commanded to wipe out the Amalekites and not to take any of their possessions. Well, we know that Saul didn't kill them all, and he did take their possessions. We see that the reverse actually happen here, where they wipe out this group of people that come from this Amalekite line, and they don't plunder any of the possessions, which I think is interesting. We see God fulfilling the purpose that he originally had for the king. Anyway, so we see that they kill the sons of Haman, and actually Esther even requests that they be hung on the gallows, which is what happened to Haman, right? Which would have probably been the Persian style of a very sharp stake that they would have been placed on. And some people think, well, maybe Esther's being a little vindictive here or something like that, but I don't think that's what she's doing. I don't think she's saying I'm trying to be braggadocious or prideful. I think what it was to do was hopefully to be a deterrent for any of these enemies to rise up again, because they saw what happened to Haman's family line, so hopefully no one would ever try to rise up again and try to kill God's people. So we see then that Haman's family is completely destroyed. We see all of the enemies of God's people, they are destroyed. And then what they do is they decide to commemorate this event of this day of victory by making a feast. And it's a 2-day feast that Mordecai and Esther send and say, basically, we want all of the Jewish people to remember this every single year, to observe it, and to make sure that we don't forget what happened here, that they let their families, their descendants, the generations, all people remember what happened here, and they call it Purim. And it says in the text, they named it that off of the word por, which, once again, that's the ancient dice that Haman used to decide what day he was going to try to kill the Jews. So they used that term to explain that the lot that Haman had cast for their destruction, God used it as a lot for his people. So it was a good lot that actually benefited God's people in the end. And so they call it Purim, which that's just the plural form of one por. So Purim, multiple por. So they call it this feast day, and it says that they celebrate it, and they have the holiday, the giving of gifts to the poor. And then at the very end, we see here that with the celebration going on, it once again focuses on Mordecai and his elevation, right? Where he, if you remember a long time ago, he was at the lowest of the low, right? Where he was potentially about to be killed. He was mourning with sackcloth and ashes, not wearing any nice robes, to where now he is second in command, has the signet ring, has the nice royal robes, and then the fear of Mordecai and his renown, his prominence, his power is all well respected, and that's kind of the way that it ends it. So you see a a huge shift from the very beginning to where the Jewish people were down and out, foreigners, to now we have them in the highest positions where we have Queen Esther and we have Mordecai second in command. So as we think about the final 2 chapters, as well as just the book as a whole, I think that one of the things that we are constantly reminded is that evil happens in this world. I think we see that in this world, bones will break, hearts will continue to break on this side of eternity. We're going to see people get cancer. We're going to see people enslaved. We're going to see people oppressed, taken advantage of, just all of these terrible things. We see that evil will happen. And in this book, we see that at the very beginning, we see a young orphan girl, a young orphan Jewish girl is taken into a harem, right, which is where many women would have had to be held there. And she's basically at the mercy of an arrogant, womanizing, power-hungry, unstable, violent king, right? We see that is happening in this story. We see the great enemy of God's people, Haman, which is probably one of the most arrogant men in the Bible. He gets promoted to the second most powerful position in the empire, and actually probably second most powerful in the world, because this is probably one of the most powerful kingdoms or empires in the world. So, like, second most powerful man in the world, and he's a wicked, evil person who hates God's people. And then we see in this chapter, in verses 6, 15, and 16 of chapter 9, we see it describing thousands of the Jewish people's neighbors rising up against them, attempting to annihilate them. And I just think that sometimes we read right past that, right? These were people that they were living among, like literally in the same city, in the same village, in the same town. It's like you look at your neighbors and just think that they had been waiting for about a year, saying, I love their house. I love that they possess that. I see that guy's wife. And they're literally been thinking and plotting wickedly. I can't wait to kill them and take all of their stuff. And we literally see, like I said, even with the second edict that shows that the king is going to be supporting and backing the Jews, still we have over 75,000 people that are still trying to kill and take advantage of the Jews. See, we see that there's true evil, true wickedness that's going to happen. And I think that the book of Esther doesn't shy away from that topic. It shows how there's evil and wickedness that's going to happen in this world. And I think that sometimes when we think about evil, or we experience suffering or evil, sometimes it makes us, maybe doubt the goodness of God, or it might even have us question the faithfulness of Christianity or the message of Christ. But I don't think it should. Rather, I think that as we see that Esther doesn't shy away from this topic, I don't think the Bible does. I think, in fact, as we think about evil in this world, we're reminded that the reality of evil actually confirms the Christian message. Don't let evil or suffering or wickedness or oppression move you away from Christianity. Recognize that it actually confirms the message. Because here's the thing. One, which you've heard me say this before, if you have evil in this world, then that points to the fact that there is something that is an objective standard of good, right? C.S. Lewis says you can't know what a crooked line is unless you know first what is something a straight line is, right? You see it dividing or being, not in a correlation with what is straight. So we see that that evil actually points to an objective standard of good. It also, I think, points to the fact that Romans 3:23 says that we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. As we think about evil, we see that scripture affirms it. It says you're going to commit, that you have committed evil, that it's not saying that evil won't exist if God exists. Rather, it says that we have rebelled against God. And then also Jesus himself, when he tells and is preparing his disciples in John 16:33, he says, "These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I have overcome the world." So Jesus is not shying away from this topic. He's saying there will be tribulation, there will be evil, there will be these bad things that happen in the world. Even we might even see the wicked ones rise to the highest power or the highest authority. So when we see governments, rising and being corrupt, and we see politicians doing whatever they're doing, remember, Jesus said this is going to happen. He said, expect this to happen. But even though we see this, and I think we're reminded of this in Scripture, I think so many times in the back of our mind, we as Christians even sometimes will be like, man, if I just had the power of God, I would just do so much. Many of us probably would, right? If we had God's power, his authority, and we knew who was about to be elected for president, or we knew who was about to do this or this case, or we saw this event happen, it'd be like, I would have just done this. I would have stopped that. I would have intervened here, right? Many of us would have probably thought about this at some point, or when we're praying and we're like getting upset why God is not answering that prayer right then and there the way we want it, right? There's so many times that we're thinking, man, if I had the power of God, I would change so much. But then there's this quote that says, you say that, but then if you had the wisdom of God, you would not change a thing. And I think that's how we need to think about it as we think about this account in Esther, or we think about the evil that we encounter in our own lives. Though we might, if we had the power of God, want to change it, if we had his wisdom, and if we saw the full story, if we saw the whole picture, we would recognize that there is a perfectly good reason why God is allowing these things to occur. And in fact, in this story, what we see is that our God will sometimes allow evil to happen, and then he's going to show that it leads to even greater goods. And in fact, I think in this book, we see that our God is a God of great reversals. And I've explained this before, but one of the key features of the book is these ironic reversals that happen, right? If you will recall early on in the book, right, where we think at first that Mordecai is going to be elevated because he saved the king very, very early on in the book, and instead all of a sudden it reverses, and all of a sudden now Haman is introduced, and he's the one that's promoted, right? And then later we see that we think Mordecai is getting ready to get killed by Haman, right? Haman's going in to talk to the king and say, hey, I want to get this guy killed. I built some gallows. And it's the same point when the king has a dream, decides he wants to, or not a dream, sorry, he gets reminded of the chronicles of what Mordecai did years later, and then he says, I want to honor him. And so then now Haman, instead of being able to kill Mordecai, he has to honor and take him around the kingdom and praise him, right? So we see that shift. And then here in verse 1, I think we see once again another great reversal. In verse 1, I want to read this again of chapter 9. Now in the 12th month, that is, the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. In the ESV, instead of it saying the opposite occurred, it says the reverse occurred. So literally what it's saying is there was this heightened expectation, right? The whole book has been talking about how there's this battle going on of good and evil, and how it seems like evil and wickedness is going to thrive and succeed. And we get to just the very first verse of chapter 9, and everything is reversed. The expectation is there, and then it says the opposite happens. And I think that we are reminded here that one verse can literally change everything. See, you can have a whole story of all this bad stuff happening, and you can just get to that one verse where God speaks and says, not anymore. I'm going to intervene. I'm changing this up. See, that's all we need. See, no matter how bad things get in life, if God says, it's over, it's over. That's how quick we see God is a God of great reversals. One moment, one word, one action, and everything changes. And as we see in the story, God can take even the darkest times, the darkest days, the darkest moments in our lives, and he can use them for good. As in Romans 8:28, I know many of us know this passage. It says, and we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. And that's exactly what we are seeing here. He was using this whole story to elevate Esther and to elevate Mordecai, and then it's going to protect his people. We see all of this happening, and though we, in the beginning of the story, we didn't see why and how this is going to work out, or why God was doing what he's doing, but ultimately we see here, it gets to the very worst potential point where millions of Jews are going to be killed, and it says, and it becomes their victory. In this passage, we see that the day of destruction became the day of deliverance, and that's what God can do. At any moment, we need to have faith in our God and recognize who our God is. The day of your greatest destruction can be the day of greatest deliverance. And I love in verse 22 here, as we see Mordecai describing what has happened here in this great reversal. He says, as the days on which the Jews had rest from their enemies, as the month which was turned from sorrow to joy for them, and from mourning to a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, of sending presents to one another and gifts to the poor. See, it says here, what God has done is it says that he has turned, or reversed, right? Done the opposite. He has turned their mourning, their sorrow to joy, and their mourning to a holiday. That's what God can do. Think about that. That is what God can do, and that's what he does for the Jewish people here. He literally turns their worst moments, and he can use it for good. So if there is something in our life that we're ashamed of, that the enemy is trying to say, hey, feel guilty about this, and has that ever happened to you where you're just, you're walking down the street, just in your house, just walking around doing whatever you need to do for the day, and something in the past just sparks, jumps in your mind, and you start feeling guilty or feel ashamed about it, and you're like embarrassed, and that's the enemy. And what God is saying, I can use even those horrible, dark, low moments and use it for my good, or for your good and for my glory. That's what God can do. God will use every single moment. He takes every moment captive, and he can use it for our good and his glory. And that's what we're seeing here. God will reverse all of these things, and he'll bring it for good. Which leads to the final thing that I want to take away from this chapter, or these chapters in this book, is that God has made promises to his people, and he will keep them, every single one of them. See, you can see here on the slide, it says, seeing the unseen God. As I've mentioned, this is one of the only books, this one in the Song of Solomon, where God is not mentioned through the entire book. They don't say Yahweh, they don't say the Lord, they didn't say God did this, right? He seems unseen to the Jewish people. But what we find here is that you don't have to see God for him to keep his promises. You don't have to know his entire plan. You don't have to see what path he's working out to know what the end result is going to be. We can see God working and fulfilling and keeping his promises, even if we don't have him speak with an audible voice. Even if we don't see him part the Red Sea like a miraculous moment, we know that God will fulfill his promises. In Hebrews 10:23, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. God has promised the church so much. If you read the scriptures, if you see what he's saying, what his promise is, what his plan is for his people, and then it says, you are to trust in that hope without wavering, because he who promised all of these things, he's faithful. He is a promise keeper. So what are these things? What is just some of the important things that God has promised his people? Well, Revelation 21:3-4. Listen to this. This is what he promises to you as his people, and he is going to fulfill it. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. That is God's promise to his people. It doesn't get any better than that. The way that they are describing what's going to happen is by negation. He's saying, hey, that thing, it's not going to be there. That thing, it's not going to happen. All of this evil that we talked about, that we see, that happens in this world, it's not going to be there. This is God's promise to you. And God is a promise keeper. That's what this book is about. Though you might not always see him, might not always know what's happening, remember his promise to you. He's going to keep it. He's going to fulfill it. And so the Jews, what they did, as we've talked about in 26, they decide that they're going to commemorate a feast of Purim to remember that fact. That's why they wanted their entire descendants, their generations, the kingdom to remember it, to celebrate it. They say, we want people to know that God is going to fulfill the promise. That even when we feel like we're in a distant Gentile land and we feel like we're distant from the temple and God's people, God still sees everything. God is with them, and God is working for their good. He will keep his promises to his people. And so that's what they do. And still today, Jews celebrate Purim. It's really, really cool to think about. See, every year, the Jews will read the book of Esther aloud Just like we studied it, they will read through the entire book as they have their 2-day festival, which is celebrated on the 14th and 15th day of Adar, which in 2023, that was March 6th and 7th. So this year, the Jews were reading the story, celebrating the fact that they know that God is with his people, that he is going to keep his promises for those who trust and follow him. And so the last thing I want to share then on this point as we're thinking about God making promises and keeping his promise is that we need to ensure as we think about the story of Esther and the Feast of Purim is that we are not to judge God in the middle of the story. See, you could have read earlier in the story and been like, God, you are terrible. God, what are you doing? God, you're not going to keep what you promised us, right? We see all of this going on, but when you get to the end of the story, you see that something dramatic happens. But so many times we in our life, we want to judge God as we're in the middle of the story. The story's not over. So what we are to do as we wait for the end result of the story, with God's promises to come, we see that we are to keep our eyes on Christ and not our circumstances. Keep your eyes on Christ, not what is going on temporarily in your story. Because in Hebrews 12:2 it says, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. See, what if Jesus got to the cross and he's like, God, bad story. God, I don't trust you. I'm not going to serve you. I'm not going to commit my spirit to you. See, many of us, we see the cross and we think that that's where the story ends. But no, it doesn't. It says that the joy that was set before him, he knew that afterward, he knew not only was he going to have a new divine family that was going to be restored and redeemed and in perfect fellowship and harmony as we read in Revelation, but it also says that he is going to be elevated and honored with all authority, and he's now at the right hand of the throne of God. See, that's what happens at the end of the story. Jesus is elevated, he is exalted, he is honored. But if we get caught up with the middle of the story, see, we need to fix our eyes on Jesus. Think about who Jesus is, what he did, and what he promises to fulfill with his kingdom. And if you look at the very end of this whole book, in verse 3, you see it says, for Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people, and speaking peace to all his countrymen. I think that this is a foreshadowing of the exaltation of Jesus. So you have this Jew who has fought for his people, stood up for his people, and now we see at the very end, he is exalted by the king, and he is now speaking peace to his people. He is offering peace, which the gospel is the gospel of peace or shalom or wholeness, completeness, totality of well-being. So we see here with Mordecai being elevated, I think it's reminding us of what Christ did for us and how he now is elevated, as Philippians 2:9-11 says. Therefore God also has highly exalted him, that is Christ, and given him the name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of those in heaven and those on earth and those under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. See, Jesus, like Mordecai, he is above all of the other names. He has been given this authority, this power, this reverence, this prominence. And because of where Jesus is at, why we fix our eyes on him, we now know that the end of our story is victory. Your story, if you are a part of God's people, ends in victory. 1 Corinthians 15:57. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. And that's exactly what happens at the end of Esther. God's people are victorious, and they celebrate the one who had made it possible for their victory, with Mordecai being exalted, which obviously points to the fulfillment with Christ is our ultimate victor, our ultimate champion, who is now exalted at the right hand of the throne, and he is interceding and petitioning and working for you.